Yep, okay, that is quorum. All right. Thank you, Jesse. So quick reminders, we are being recorded, and now that we are on Zoom, we are also being broadcast live via Boxcast. These recordings will be on YouTube starting tomorrow. And then I know we moved, so we are still using raise hands before speaking. It just helps the conversation. It's kind of in the same place at the bottom of your screen. There's a little reactions button, smiley face with a plus. If you click on that, and then you should see raise hand as one of the options. So just please keep that in mind. We do have someone who hasn't been able to join us before. So Counselor Shaw, I would love it if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, the name that you prefer to go by, your pronouns, and just to be in line with kind of what we did our last couple of meetings, why you chose to volunteer on the Charter Review Committee. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Kim. Excited to be here. Jeanette Shaw, City Councilor. I go by she, her pronouns, and excited to be just a part of this community to see what we can do to further enhance the charter. And I apologize for not being at the first two. I had a conflict, and unfortunately the Parks and Rec also meets tonight. So I'll have to depart a little early since I'm the council liaison, but very much looking forward to the discussion and participating. Thank you, Kim. And great to see familiar faces.
Thank you for being here. So just to cover a couple of things that have happened. I know we've had 3 weeks since our last meeting. So one of the items that we had sent out was the charter history. So all of the amendments that both passed and failed since the Tigard Charter was originally passed in 1962. Just wanted to point out that it is supposed to be kind of a data point. It's not a guide. You'll have noticed that there were some things that failed 1 year and passed 3 years later, some things that failed 1 year and then passed 3 decades later, and things that were passed and then reversed and then passed again. So there's been a lot of change over time. But I did want to point out 3 trends that I noticed in that work that I thought were really interesting. One being that there's been a preference towards gender neutrality over time. So that kind of coincides with our work last week. There were at least 2 amendments trying to move towards more gender neutral language. They didn't quite hit the mark completely, but I think what we accomplished last meeting should be able to do that. The second is that there's been a lot of changes towards referencing state law rather than continuing to really lay everything out in the charter that's covered in like great scope through state law. One great example is in the original charter, there was a lot of detail about the elections process, and that was later repealed in the 80s and referred to state law to govern that elections process in the city. And the third one is, you may have noticed, Section 7 covers a lot of ground. It's called Section 7, Mayor and Councilors. It lays out really the entire baseline for our elected officials, how many there are, how they're elected, term limits, how vacancies are filled. There's a lot going on there. It's also the section that has had the most changes made to it of any other section in the charter. So it's just kind of an interesting trend to have seen, and we'll be spending a lot of time in this group as well, going through that. And based on kind of the skeleton that we laid out, that framework that we picked up on, kind of dividing some of those different areas out. So it's not just one monster section that covers all that ground. Karen, please.
I don't have the document you're talking about. So do you know when you shared it so I could look?
I do. I sent it the Thursday following our second meeting. And it's totally fine. There's nothing that's in that document that you're going to have needed to have reviewed for this meeting, and I can happily resend it at the end.
Found it. Thank you.
Great. So for folks who had also looked through it, was there anything also that caught anybody else's eye that they'd like to raise to the group? Trends that they'd seen or anything that they found unusual in the changes that have been made over the years? Yes, John.
You know, we talked about it before, but the changes in here are nice, but I think what some people may need to know is, we'll take the November 2015, the latest one in there. You know, it says that they both failed, but one of them failed 70 to 30, and one of them failed 51-49. So I look at those really different. To me, if it's 70-30, the public didn't want it. The 51-49, did we ask the right question at the wrong time or the wrong question at the right time? So, I look at those things. Sometimes to me, how much they passed or failed by comes into play as much as did they pass or fail.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You can also look, there's a lot of interesting times where they went to the ballot, a lot of May and September votes and off November. So you definitely see different people coming to the ballot depending on which of those times that you're choosing to take it to the voters. Anything else? Okay, moving on. One last thing is just to talk about kind of our ongoing process with this group. There were 3 questions that really came up last meeting that we were getting from you guys that we are going to be trying to answer in our presentations going forward. One being, what is current practice in Tigard and how's it going? The second question being, what is best practice or what are other jurisdictions doing? And third being, how could this be exploited by bad actors? What are ways that this particular language can be maybe misused? And then what are the ways that you can protect against that, either through charter language or ordinance language? So going forward, you can expect to hear from us in answer to all 3 of those questions, given that that has clearly been your interest. And I really appreciate that direction from this group. So all the admin out of the way, we left our last conversation on ordinances discussing 1 reading or 2 readings. We kind of left the conversation saying that we still liked 1 reading, but we're interested in an ordinance that could force 2 readings if there were certain circumstances, number of people coming to give public comment, or a counselor maybe requesting a 2nd reading. There were a couple of folks who had their hands up when unfortunately we had to end that conversation. One of those was Derek, who's with us again tonight. So Derek, if you have any thoughts since our last meeting, or if you'd written down what you'd wanted to say last time, please take it away.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about it for a couple of weeks. So it was something that John had said that I really liked. He was saying, and I think that everyone agrees that the business of the city should be free enough to try to conduct business that's really just ordinary. And the example that was used when we last met was whistling in like a public restroom or something. And I don't think anybody's going to dispute that that maybe we shouldn't have multiple readings for something like that. And so I think what had been floated by the group at the time was making whether or not the city needed an additional reading contingent upon whether or not members of the public showed up. And John had a really nice change to that, which was, why make it contingent on the public, but rather the counselors themselves. And that was kind of my thinking as well after considering what he had said. I thought that was a great idea. And I was going to put to the group, what if we made it so that if there was a unanimous, if the counselors believed unanimously that something should pass, if we had something, that we can all agree is kind of ridiculous, like whistling in a restroom, then no additional reading is required and they can vote. But if there are others that want to consult the kitchen cabinet, as I think it was put previously, then allow them to do so. And that was what I wanted to add at that time. So I appreciate you coming back to me.
Thank you, Derek. And Margaret, please.
The one question I had, because I think I read in the current charter that there's 1 reading, but the wording and the information is out a week before the council meeting. And so it's not that all of a sudden, oh my gosh, what are they doing? It's it's out, it's published, it's so on. And that's my first observation. And then the second one is, if the city council wants to continue discussion on that, they still have the right to do that, correct? Okay, I don't think 1 reading is fine.
Thank you, Margaret. All right, so we had, Karen, please.
Okay, I too ended up with a question based on things that Jason and John had shared. And one of the things shared was that when something was foreseen as being potentially controversial. A public listening or learning session was planned, or multiple ones, or it was just going to be 2 readings. And I was wondering if that was because someone was really smart and decided to do the right thing, or if there was a procedure already somewhere that kind of indicated that that would be the right thing to do.
Shelby, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's, I mean, not taking credit that we're super smart for it, but it is the latter. It is that it's just because of the public interest, the expectation that there is going to be a lot of public participation, or that people will care about it, that it's a meaningful topic as opposed to a prohibition on whistling in the bathrooms, that yeah, we will schedule it for multiple sessions. And also, like for a land use case, if we know that it's going to be like a legislative land use change, it will have both a hearing before Planning Commission and a hearing before City Council, so that the public can get the broadest participation possible. And then to Margaret's point about the notice, so yes, typically our council notices are put out a week beforehand. That's something we try to do. By law, it's no less than 24 hours. And so there will always be notice of something, either because we're planning a week in advance, or at a minimum 24 hours by law.
Thank you, Shelby. So I think the proposition that is currently on the table is to retain the 1 reading, and then to either as council rules or through an ordinance allow for councilors to move to have multiple readings. Is that in line? You can just kind of nod. All right, Shelby, how do you feel comfortable with that direction, or would you like a formal vote?
So I think, is there anybody that has concern with that? Otherwise, we'll take it as consensus. All right. I see consensus.
All right, thank you all very much. And with that, we will move on to our new business, starting with public improvements. Shelby, let you start off, and then we'll have some time for Q&A.
All right. So, this discussion is, it's called public improvements, but the charter sections it includes a bunch of different items. So just taking them in the list, I think the easiest, that most people understand the best, is condemnation. The right of a city to use eminent domain to take property with just compensation. So right now, Tigard has a charter provision that basically requires a resolution of necessity passed by City Council before we start a condemnation process. So we attached ORS Chapter 35. I'm sure nobody read the entire thing, but it was attached to show how detailed state law is in condemnation procedures. So the resolution of necessity is not something that Tigard created. It is absolutely a creature of state law, as is pretty much everything else about condemnation. It is in the Oregon Constitution and the federal that just compensation is required. So property can be taken without compensation to the property owner, and everything else is governed by statute. So the question really before this group is, do we need any other parameters on condemnation in the city charter? Is it appropriate to stay there, or should we defer to state law and either be silent in the charter, or just refer to that Tigard will follow state law?
So before we start discussion, any questions about condemnation? Okay, yes, Jason.
Sorry, I couldn't find the button fast enough.
It's okay.
Shelby, can you comment on, like, and maybe this is premature, but I guess my question would be, is there some compelling reason why the language that's in the charter from your perspective legally should be there as opposed to referencing state law? Like, is it the way it's structured now? Is there a purpose as we're thinking about this?
So in my opinion, there is no purpose. It's an inherent right that the city has. And so going back to the home rule discussion, it's not a right that we need to claim in our charter. It's inherent. And again, state law really covers everything about procedures and timelines and what notice is required and all of that. So I would have no sad feelings if this section was taken out entirely.
Margaret, please.
And my question is, I assume we have to follow state law. We just can't go through and go our own way.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the question for all of the things that we're going to be discussing in the charter that refer to state law. So, okay, that's what I thought.
Thanks, Margaret. Any other thoughts or questions around condemnation? John, please.
I just think that everybody needs to know. It gets very confusing. Citizens are very worried that the city willy-nilly goes and does condemnation. The fact that it can happen is very different than it will happen. I mean, we used it on Burnham Street when we did the remodel and addition to the street. We actually had we were trying to do one on Main Street, and actually the owner came to us and asked us to do the condemnation because due to the mortgage holder, they were not allowed to sell the one little strip of piece of land that we wanted. So they actually asked us to condemn it. And then therefore they were able to take it off and the mortgage company couldn't say anything about it. So they were willing to sell it. We had agreed and everything. So a lot of times people feel that we just go in and try and tear stuff down. So that's the one thing that I don't think people realize. And then the second thing is, and this is where I think it gets really confusing to the public, is before we even start down the path of doing condemnation, we actually have to go to a council meeting and say, we might condemn something. Well, everybody gets up in arms and feels, oh no, they're going to come and take it. But by state law, we have to tell them before we start anything, which, 99% of the time we won't even look at condemnation. But the fact that we have to state that up front gets everybody upset. So I just want to let everybody know that's sort of my history of how we've had it in Tigard.
Thank you, John. So just kind of go back to those three questions that I've been hearing from this group. The one being, what does Tigard do? How's it going? Tigard follows the state law. What do other jurisdictions do? In the other charters, there is no condemnation provision, and they follow the state law. And the third one, what are kind of on-ramps for exploitation? And there really aren't, because state law is so comprehensive. Yes, Jeanette, please.
Thank you, and great conversation by both Jason and John. And Shelby, is there any downside to just referencing the state law, or does that change often enough or get amended often enough that it wouldn't make sense, just to John's point, that the city does acknowledge it and it's important enough to reference it in the charter?
So there isn't a downside so long as we leave it vague enough. So there is a legal principle that the city cannot delegate certain authorities to the legislature. And so sometimes it is challenged where if it's ORS chapter 35.220, and we say the city will follow ORS 220, and then the legislature amends that, there is an argument that, well, did the city mean ORS 220 as of the time it was adopted or subsequent? Because subsequent, that creates confusion. Did we have the ability to delegate to the legislature to change it like that? And so if we did want to follow something, or if we did want to reference state law, I would just say something super broad, like for condemnation procedures, the city will follow state law.
Thank you. So I hear that this conversation is going that we would remove the language around condemnation and reference state law. Does anyone feel differently?
So I guess I would pose the question of, is there a need to say that we're going to reference state law, or do we just follow the law?
And remove it entirely. Thank you, Sean.
Right.
Karen, please.
Yeah, I see John nodding, but I really do like the idea of putting it, and actually because of how you described it, this is something that scares people and concerns people, and just seems like if it's in there that says we're gonna follow state law, then we're gonna follow state law. I like the idea of having a sentence in there.
Thank you, Karen. And we've certainly put those sentences in other places. Margaret, please.
And that might help just for clarity's sake. And so people can't go back and say, what are you doing? Well, we're following state law. So
Okay, so it sounds
one
like
of those things you really don't have to have in there, but I think for transparency and clarity for really the very, very small group of people in Tigard that would really get upset about that. So.
okay, so it sounds like the proposal on the table right now is to remove most of the language around condemnation and reference that the city will follow state law. Any opposition? All right, everyone kind of nod.
Mhm.
Okay, Shelby, is that good?
All right, yep, that sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, so the next section is on local improvement districts. It's called improvements, but I think that is confusing in the charter. So to start with, what is a local improvement district? So a local improvement district is typically used when new infrastructure is being built in an area and it is expensive infrastructure and it is impacting a certain area. So if it's, a lot of times it's with like new development, an area that doesn't have sewer, water, paved roads. So what it is it says that the group of people who are impacted by that area, who will benefit from that new infrastructure, will pay for the benefit of that infrastructure over time on their property taxes is usually how it works, or through a city lien. So it's not, if the city comes and does a road project in your neighborhood, it's not that. It's not that the city is planning development, like in River Terrace. There may be a local improvement district. We haven't done them in ages. John probably has the most experience with them as anybody, because they tend to be a historical tool for when the area didn't have any infrastructure in it. And again, it tends to be big projects like sewer and water. We do still have a couple that we're paying off, but we haven't done a new one in the recent history that I'm aware of. So, so this issue, so it is governed by state law. There are statutes on local improvement districts. The questions really focus on, one, do we need it in the code or in the charter? And then two, the meeting guide had kind of two ways to approach it. So Tigard's was, it will not be established if this and this happens. Whereas Beaverton's said, we will establish it if this and this happens. And so it's basically, is it a check on the ability of the city to implement it, or is it a requirement that the city implement it if there's a certain number of people requesting it? Or do we just stay silent on it? So really, so it's a funding tool for the city to use that hasn't happened very often. So that's kind of where we are. So it's not something that comes up very much.
Jason, please.
I would say most of John and my experience with this has been in unwinding ones that got messed up or weren't working properly, that were old and never had a conclusion in some cases. Those were pretty weird. Shelby, I think you helped us unwind at least one or two of those that had just sort of gone on for years and years and years and made it difficult for, I think in one case, for a property owner to ever sell their empty land. And, I think my understanding of this process too, and actually having a Tigard parcel that was in one at one time or is in one. The way it works is there's a certain period of time during which if the property owner benefits from it, then they end up paying for it. But if they go 15 or 20 years and never benefit from it, then they don't ever end up paying for it. At least that's my understanding of and my experience in one of my own parcels of property. So I think that's an important clarification too. Like it's not an indefinite type of thing.
Thank you, Jason. And Carol, please.
Yeah, I just had a question. Does this include sewer reimbursement districts?
So a reimbursement district is a little bit different. It could be included. So a reimbursement district is generally that instead of the city doing a project, it is that there's an area of new development that is not necessarily adjacent to the city. And there will be so if the city is here and then the new area is here, there's this gap of area in between. And the gap area will benefit from the improvement because if we're extending it out here, this place will be included. So a reimbursement district says that the gap people have to pay usually it's a private developer who pays to bring the infrastructure all the way out. And so it's kind of the same general theory of a bunch of people who benefit from an improvement will have to pay for it, but it's a little bit different as to how it's implemented, how it's initiated, and then who the ultimate responsible payer is, whether it's the city that does it or a private developer. So in terms of our charter, they're a little bit similar, a little bit different. So depending on when you ask, does it apply? It depends on what exactly you're looking at applying.
Okay.
Thanks, Shelby. And Tony, please.
Can you hear me okay? I'm using different equipment this time. So,
Yep.
Oh, great, perfect. I think unless there's a circumstance where the city might want to do what it's able to do outside of what the state law requires, because sometimes, you can do more of something or less of something, like you can be less strict, or you can be more strict depending on how the rules or the direction that the legislation is. If it's not going to be changed, I think I like the idea of maybe following suit with the previous kind of concept, is making a statement that the city will just follow state law. That way there's a little bit of, as much as possible, the consistency of that kind of position for the charter.
Thank you, Tony. And Karen, please.
I had asked Kim earlier and she wanted me to ask here, I think. I was trying to picture, especially since you said we haven't done this in a long time. For instance, if the city wanted to provide internet citywide, is that something that would fall under this public improvement district? Or I just was trying to think of an example to think through the process.
Yeah, so probably not.
Okay.
If it's a citywide, these are really targeted at small, confined, discrete areas that will uniquely benefit from this extension. So sewer and water to areas that haven't had it before are really the best examples and the only time it's been used. So I realize that doesn't really help because most places in Tigard have sewer and water already, but that was, those are really the examples of what it's been used for.
Thank you. And Karen, does that answer your question? Okay, great. John, please.
Yeah, an example of where it was used in Tigard's largest population annexation they ever did. The area was called the Walnut Island. And that area basically is 121st Street between Gardy and Walnut Street. And that area all in there was called the Walnut Island. That actually brought the most people into the city in an annexation at one time. That whole area was an LID. that they did for sewer in that area. And so, Carol, it's not a reimbursement district like Shelby was talking about, but it was one where everybody shared in and paid into the cost if they wanted to join up to the sewer. So it was like an option that they could. That's where Jason was talking about, is some people decided 15 years later they wanted to do it, some people didn't. And then it was stuck in your title that you could or couldn't do it. And then you couldn't sell your property, and it got really confusing. So, those are the biggest ones where we've used them, but most times we're trying to unravel them versus trying to do new ones.
There were also some street and street and sidewalk ones done too, Karen.
Thank you. And Nathan, please.
Thanks. So I'm struggling a little bit in my head on how to phrase this, but so I was thinking kind of about the second question first when I was first looking at this, and kind of the difference between the obligation language versus the check on power language. So the way I understood the obligation type language would be, if a neighborhood has enough support and approaches the city is compelled to make that improvement. And that's not necessarily true under the check on power version. Where does state law fall on that spectrum? I didn't quite understand that.
Yeah, so state law is silent on it. So state law, so the Beaverton's is the affirmative power. So basically, like if you lived in a neighborhood without sidewalks and repeatedly asked the city, I want a sidewalk here, and the city said, no, it's not going to be in our budget. This would be something that the neighbors could get together and say, we are willing to pay for it. We want to lean on our property. We want a sidewalk. So that would be the affirmative grant. Under state law, it's really silent. So there is no, the neighbors can request it. It doesn't mean the city has to do it. And likewise, if there are certain procedures under state law, like to appeal it. So it's not that there's no ability to challenge it, but it's not as defined in terms of the ability to challenge it under state law as our charter currently is right now.
Thank you, Shelby. So the proposition that is last put on the table, which was to defer to state law. Jason and John, this is a very wonky topic. You two have the most lived experience working on it. So if either of you would like to react to that proposal or propose something different, I would entertain either of you. You're looking at each other via Zoom.
I was trying to find the raise. I'm trying to follow your request here.
Appreciate that.
So I guess the way I would phrase this is I need to probably think more about how I feel about the concept of sort of compelling the city to do things is, I think, that kind of at times the bigger picture and an overall strategy needs to probably be what is most important in particular situations. And I guess I would be, I need to think through that a lot more if we were going to compel the city to do things, small groups of people compelling the city. At the same time, I think this is an important tool that should be used and can be used. We haven't found good uses for it recently because our needs are somewhat different, but I think that it could potentially be leveraged in different ways. It's a way of financing things that allows people to deduct it on their property taxes, usually is borrowed at a much lower rate than an individual would get. I mean, there's benefits to doing this, which is why one of the reasons the tool is used. But I'm curious to know what John thinks about sort of being able, any group of people being able to sort of compel the city to act in a certain way on one of these topics. I think that could also potentially get out of hand with unintended consequences.
My comment would be, I agree totally. And I'm back to sort of what Nathan was talking about, is compelling somebody versus allowing them. So I like the allowing versus compelling. I understand if a group of people, if 5 houses come forward and want to put sidewalks in their cul-de-sac. But at the same time, some of the drawbacks from that are every time we do that, it can cause incremental issues related to neighbors from that. It can cause right-of-way issues. It can cause issues where we have to put in ADA ramps maybe on another street that we now have to pay for that didn't really relate to them. But anytime we do work on or near that street, we're required to do ADA. So there's other aspects of it where they're saying, well, I'm not going to pay for something over on that street, but now all of a sudden we're required to do that as a city. I think that's the issues that I run into. If it's, 100 houses want to do it, I think it makes sense. I have a hard time. I think our public works would really not be happy if groups of cul-de-sacs here and there of 5 houses wanted to do it. I think scheduling wise and time and commitment of the employees, they would be very upset. So that would be my worry. I like the fact that it's available, but I don't like the word compelled because I think there's unintended consequences that relate to it that people aren't thinking about.
Thank you, John. Lindsay, please.
Two questions. Kind of the first is that if we do leave it to reference, state law, is that, vague enough? Like we've talked about leaving the charter vague enough that we really leave a lot of these decisions up to the counselors in case by case basis and hope that they are able to make the best decisions. So that's one kind of question, because I think we do want citizens to be able to be involved and ask. And then I guess another thought is kind of looking at the equity of this, where, do we end up having neighborhoods where people have higher incomes and so they get the best sidewalks because they're willing to pay the taxes, rather than looking at the city and saying, we want Tigard to be accessible and walkable and safe, and let's think about this collectively, rather than letting, people with higher incomes that might be more, like agreeable to paying more taxes on something so they get better sidewalks. So kind of two separate questions, but thoughts there that I'd like to just throw out to the group.
Yeah, those are great points, Lindsay. Would anyone like to comment? John, you unmuted.
Yeah. So, Lindsay, actually, I agree with that point, but in reality, it's the actual opposite. We actually have areas of the city that we get grant funding for, where we put sidewalks in neighborhoods that are all low income. So it actually works in the opposite. The people that can afford it, if you actually look at our neighboring cities, Lake Oswego, their most expensive homes don't have sidewalks. So usually it doesn't happen that way. As a city, we actually try to align adding sidewalks near schools, and that's the main focus that we use city dollars for. But we usually go out and get grant dollars, which happens every couple of years. Through the county, we get federal and state money that we use, and that always goes to low income areas, Center Street, Fruing Street, Ash Street, some of the other areas where we specifically put those sidewalks in, and other people could come up and say something, and we're like, well, you guys didn't have to pay for it. So it's great for the city and the other citizens, but usually it's the opposite. Usually the people that have the money don't want the sidewalk there because they don't want people walking in front of their house. I'm sorry. It's just, it seems weird, but it's the way it is.
Yeah, and they all have cars. They don't have to walk or get to the bus or bike or things. Thanks, John. That's helpful.
Thank you. So the current proposal still is referencing to state law in the charter and removing the other language around. I think it's just called improvements is the chapter name, section name. Any disagreement with that proposal? Great, Shelby.
Okay, we're on a roll. So next section is special assessments. So this is It basically already says that it's governed by general ordinance. There are no statutes specifically on special assessments, though there are plenty of rules, laws that relate to taxes and levying taxes or levies or bonds. So this is really a broad section. And the fact that it's 2 lines is representative of that. So I do think a charter should include that the council has the authority to govern this, to set its own rules here. But beyond that, I don't have any recommendations of anything specific. Again, there are local budget law has the requirements for what kind of measures, taxes have to be put to the vote in order to impose taxes on property tax bills. Fees are different. Fees can be assessed on utility bills. The city already has the general authority to do that. So I'm happy to answer any questions. But in my opinion, this is a inherent power of the city that we want to maintain, but not necessarily do anything else to, because it's governed elsewhere.
Great. Let's start with any questions, clarification. Jeanette, please.
Thank you. So Shelby, just following up on that, is your recommendation to leave it as is?
I would clean up the language a little and are consistent with our trend of modernizing and making it a little more user-friendly. I would clean it up. I would keep the concept the same though.
Thank you. And Zachary.
I would just like to, well, I mean, yeah, so it was about like taxes, right? And stuff like the city has the ability to change taxes at any time. Is that what we're?
No, we don't have the ability to change taxes at any time.
Oh, okay. So,
either by charter or
would
otherwise.
Okay.
We're talking about the special assessments. It is section 39 under chapter 9 of public improvements.
Kim, maybe you or Shelby could explain an example of that to Zachary or to all of us, frankly.
Yep.
Yeah, so so one example for special assessment. So on your Tigard utility bills right now, you have a Tigard Parks and Recreation fee. So that would be one that is approved by council. It appears on your utility bill. The city adopts the methodology or how on what calculations the fee is going to be based, and the city determines how to assess it. So that is an example of the city enforcing or collecting on a special assessment. Looking at it now, though, this is just applicable to public improvements, the way it's currently worded. So a special assessment for public improvements, I honestly can't think of an example that we have used. So, or in Oregon, the taxes, the city's permanent taxes is set by law. We have no ability to change that. We do have the ability to pass by voter approved special local option levies or general obligation bonds approved by voters. So if there was a capital improvement project, such as building a new city hall that you might be hearing about shortly, that would have to be approved if we wanted to issue general obligation bonds for that, or impose a local option levy, although for capital, it's always a bond, that would have to be approved by the voters. So you have probably voted on them before with TVF&R. They'll put local option or general obligation bonds on the ballot to build a fire station. And so it would be something like that, a public improvement that the public would have to vote on. So I honestly don't know. I can't think of an example of a public improvement that we have issued a special assessment for. I will look to John for history.
Oh, he's been shaking his head since you started. Zachary.
Okay, thank you. It really helps. I just thought I'd let you know that I have had I still have it, a mandatory IB meeting from like 6 to 8. So it's kind of conflicting with this. And I was wondering if I should just stay in this because they'll let me do this if I just, pick whatever group for it. And I don't really mind staying in this meeting. But I just thought I'd clarify that with you because I think I emailed Kim and Zell and told her that I don't think I can make it because of the meeting. So
I think whatever is, we don't want to conflict with your schooling. So as long as you're getting like the full benefit out of the IB meeting and you can be here, that's fine. But if the IB meeting seems probably pretty important. We don't want to conflict with your schooling. There'll be 9 more of these meetings too.
okay, great. So yeah, I'll just show up to the meeting then. I thought I would clarify that with you too, but I didn't know if you saw the email or not because I didn't get a response yet. But I really appreciate that. I'll see you next meeting if that's okay.
Yep, see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, Zachary.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye.
Margaret, please.
Okay. I don't have a question, it's just more of a comment, but I think that we should leave the, at least, cleaned up language in there about the assessment, just for transparency's sake. I think it's one of these things that doesn't necessarily have to be in there, but, and we don't do those assessments very often, if hardly ever. But I think just for transparency's sake, it wouldn't hurt to keep it in.
Thank you, Margaret. And Tony, please.
I guess Margaret kind of touched on something I was thinking too, but my question is kind of for Shelby. It sounds like you can't think of an example where we have. Can you think of an example where we could? Because it kind of sounds like that's where the challenge is coming from. It's like the language could be in there, but when would it even be possible to actually put this into use? Because assessments are for improvements in this context. If you were doing an improvement, like say you wanted to do citywide bike lanes or citywide sidewalks, and it wouldn't be a single improvement area, would that maybe be a context for an assessment? Or if there's a type of utility that could be done in a citywide kind of thing, would that be a possibility? And if not, do we need it? Or that's kind of my question.
Yeah, so the fact that it's charged against real property means that it has to be assessed. So it would be like a lien, something that we would have the ability to assess a lien for. So my best guess would be that this would relate to something like a reimbursement district or a local improvement district, and that when it refers to a special assessment, that it's not a citywide public improvement that would be like a levy or a bond. But if it's assessed against the real property, that it would be something that we could lien, and that would be an LID or a reimbursement district. That would be consistent because we do have general ordinances governing LIDs and reimbursement districts. So I would tie it to the previous section in terms of if we were to use it for anything, I think that is how we would use it for.
Thank you, Shelby. And Jason.
Shelby, would one example, I'm just thinking about whether there are any examples, and I know that the River Terrace we have kind of an overlay that's more for SDC specifically, but is that, I mean, this is a more general description. Would that be considered to fit in this classification to some extent? And if so, I'd be happy to explain a little bit more about it, about what in real life, what that was, but.
Yeah, actually, I think SDCs could be another example. Yes, it's a special assessment for a public improvement. It's not assessment. I mean, I guess it's a special calculation, a special fee applied to a certain property. So I think it could fit in that category.
That's an example of where we've at least used it. So the short version of that story is that some of the road infrastructure, I think primarily in River Terrace, was going to be more expensive than our transportation SDCs would typically cover, and working in partnership with the developers and other stakeholders, we ended up basically creating an add-on to the normal SDCs for the River Terrace area for a period of time to get all the work done that needs to be done and get it financed. I know some other cities have gone pretty, maybe rogue is not the right word, but fairly aggressive in what they consider a utility. Some cities are even considering their police departments utilities, which we're not going to debate here tonight. But in that way, you know, they could conceivably use this type of an assessment probably for that kind of, if you were being that aggressive. We've never been that aggressive, and I'm not really sure I agree it's the right thing, but some Oregon cities have done that.
Yeah, and the system development charge that Jason referenced is governed by ordinance. So again, that is consistent with that statute or that charter section as well.
Thank you all. So the proposition on the table is to clean up the language, but to maintain that concept of the special assessments in the charter. Are there any other thoughts, disagreement, comments? Okay. Looks like we're good. So Shelby, is that direction for you?
Yep, that sounds good.
Oh, we do have one comment, Karen.
Well, I wanted to wait till now to go back. The guidance that we gave for the LID part, does that mean we're keeping the 6-month delay due to a remonstrance in, or is that out?
So I would interpret that as being out, because that's more than what's required by state law.
Thank you, Karen. And Shelby, bids, our last section of public improvements.
All right, so bids are a little easier to understand than the more esoteric ones that we've been discussing. So our charter currently has a section on bids, which talks about how to award a contract. So one of the other sections that you got was ORS 279C, which is an extensive section of Oregon law that includes how to award bids for public improvement contracts. So this is, again, a heavily regulated area of law. It is also an area of law that is that doesn't change super frequently, but it doesn't change infrequently. So, for example, one of the things that the legislature has done to us is qualification-based selection. So for Jason and John are rolling their eyes. So this says that for public improvement, for certain positions, architects, landscapers, engineers, certain professions, that the city cannot look at price until going through a qualification selection first. And so we have to determine who are the most qualified contractors, and then we can negotiate price with the first in order, second in order, third in order. So I am concerned that the current charter provision does potentially conflict with state law because depending on what the contract includes, certainly public improvement contracts include extensive engineering landscaping architect type improvements, that we don't always have the ability to make the award based on the lowest responsible bidder, that sometimes there are other statutory rules that we need to follow. So I actually, on this one, I will say my recommendation is to remove it entirely and not reference anything about awarding bids in our charter. I think it's a little too specific. And again, because that area of law changes not infrequently, I think in order to be flexible and keep up with the state law, that we should defer entirely to the state law and not reference it in our charter. We also have public contracting rules that council adopts that provide greater detail on public contracting, and those are in addition to the state statute. So this is a heavily regulated area of law that we have to follow. So my recommendation would be to take it out.
And I think it's worth noting that it is not in either the Beaverton or the LOC model charter either. Lindsay, please.
And it's my understanding that this is becoming even more of a heavily scrutinized area, given the last 2 rounds of federal funding and just looking at procurement, and again with looking at equitable practices in that. So really, this state is going to be heavily scrutinized, and so in theory, falling from that, we'll kind of be doing the best practices just by following that, because like you said, it changes a lot as they're looking into this more and more, and realizing that this is actually a big area of government that was fairly unregulated for a while. So I think that's great that it's being looked into, but safe to say that that will keep changing with best practices, and the state will be leading in that anyways.
Thank you, Lindsay. Any other comments? Jason, please.
I mean, I agree with taking it out. I think the experiences we've had with some of these things, while they were, I guess, intended to be, the QBS, the qualification-based bidding or services can kind of be described as like, you don't really want to go pick your helicopter tour flight with who's got the biggest coupon necessarily. And that was sort of the impetus, I think, from the state's perspective or the legislature's perspective, was to say, hey, you need to look at the quality of these things where quality really matters and skills matter, and try to come to agreement with them. And that was a big change that happened while John and I were both in office. And it changed the dynamics of the conversation. I think just following state law and staying silent on it is probably a good approach.
Thank you, Jason. And Margaret, please. Oh, Margaret, sorry, you're muted.
When I put this down the other day, I had number 4, I said not necessary. Because I was in the legislature when we did this. I do believe I was chair of business and labor when we did this, so blame me.
Thank you, Margaret. All right, so the proposal on the table right now is to follow the city attorney's recommendation and remove bids from the charter entirely, as it is an area that is covered pretty thoroughly by state law and ordinance. I see thumbs up. I see lots of nodding. I feel like a flight attendant when you're in the emergency row, but this is okay. Shelby, does that give you the direction?
Yep, perfect. Out it comes.
Thank you. All right, so everybody, we made it through public improvements. That may be the wonkiest, hardest to understand section that we'll be going through in the charter. Although we will have other sections, I'm sure, that will generate more conversation. But debt limit is next. And so Shelby, please.
All right, so debt limit, and I will also refer to or ask John if I need to phone a friend on the financial impacts here. So, Oregon law does prescribe rules for city borrowing, which is ultimately what this section is getting at. So there are rules about how to issue debt. and how much debt the city can issue. So this section, I have asked our bond counsel to review. We have specialized legal counsel that assists the city with issuing debt and all things related to borrowing. Her suggestion on this was to defer to the League of Oregon Cities model charter. Her concern is that the city apparently mixes consent of the voters and voluntary floating indebtedness, which, as I understand it, is basically the bonds the city can issue that are not voter approved. So her read of this was that it kind of conflicts with itself. So again, it's governed by state law. Her suggestion was to refer to the state statute, very similar to what Beaverton did, and also the League of Oregon Cities model charter.
And I'm gonna just go ahead and copy and paste. Oh no, I can't. We don't have chat available. So this model charter language does say city indebtedness may not exceed debt in limits imposed by state law. A charter amendment is not required to authorize city indebtedness. Karen, please.
The second sentence seems more like a comment to the users of the document than a statement that really should be in the charter. Like to explicitly say that we don't need to make an amendment to authorize a bond, seems odd. So I like just the one sentence like Beaverton did.
Shelby, I would love your take on this, but it reads to me like something very old. So you might have noticed, so when we sent out the document of all of the charter amendments, a lot of the early charter amendments that were voted on had to do with increasing the city's debt limit to a specific amount. So my read of this was that this might be just something that is a little outdated, but that might apply in some cities.
Yeah, I think either one of those. It could be old, it could not be reflective of the changes. And I think there are some cities that do require voter approval to change the debt limit. So yeah, Beaverton's is, I think, cleaner and easier to understand.
Let's go with it then.
All right, Beaverton's one is just that first sentence, city indebtedness may not exceed the debt limits imposed by state law. So if all folks are in agreement, any dissent? Nathan, please.
So I just had a question about kind of the other piece of the existing text about liability. Where does that end up in lack of charter language?
Yeah, so right now under Oregon local budget law, a city official who spends money that has not been budgeted through the correct budgeting process is potentially personally responsible for it, personally liable for it. So there is already existing statutory law that says that a city official who misspends funds is potentially personally liable for it. So if it's intention, so I would say it's covered by state statute. I think this section is a little bit more narrowly focused, just because it's focused just on indebtedness as opposed to statutory, which is focused on budgeting and actually expending the money. So a similar, close, but not quite.
Thank you, Shelby. Nathan, do you disagree with the current proposal?
No, I don't. I was just, well, for one thing, I did try to look through the state ordinances and had a little trouble finding exactly what I was looking for. So I was just curious, but that question of liability wasn't completely answered for me in my own reading. So, but I agree with the proposal.
Thank you, Nathan. And thank you for that question. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and Nathan, to your point, the personal liability is actually in local budget law, which is ORS 294. So if you had trouble finding it in the indebtedness section, is because it's not there.
Thank you.
All right, so we are going to move on into our if time allows topic. We moved very quickly through public improvements and debt limit. We do have a special guest here tonight. We have Brian Rager. He's the Director of Public Works at Tigard. And he can answer any questions that you have about, I'm sure everyone read in detail and completely understood the water system plan. But if you had any lingering questions, Brian is here to answer them. So maybe Brian, do you want to start us off? Just give a quick overview of this provision and what was in that system plan?
Sure. I believe we sent you chapter 4 out of the system plan. And just want to I'll just say a few words, just want to draw your attention to the fact that our primary source right now is the Clackamas River. We also have our aquifer storage and recovery wells that were a good investment, and that helps us in the summertime to cut down on what we have to take out of the river. We also have some emergency interties with Beaverton and with Tualatin. You'll also know in that chapter there's some discussion about water rights. We're part of a partnership of the Willamette River Water Consortium, and through that partnership we have rights on the Willamette. We have made some investments in the Willamette, even though we can't use the water yet due to this provision. We made an investment in the Willamette intake facility, and kind of gets our foot in the door, so to speak, so that we have a seat at the table as a part of the Willamette intake facility commission. Figure 4-2, that's the graph that shows what we have at our disposal and kind of a general forecast of how far out in the future that will take us. This is as good a projection as we could make in 2020 when this system plan was updated. And you'll see that by around roughly 2028, 2029, we're looking at an expansion of the Lake Oswego system to give us another 4 MGD. And at some point, that red line gets to a place where we know we run out of capacity in our current. Oh, thanks, Kim. We run out of capacity in our current source. So what's next? Really, the only other option out there for us is the Willamette. We believe that that's a reliable source. The water, Wilsonville has been using it for a couple of decades, and now we've got the Willamette Water Supply Project led by Tualatin Valley Water District, and the way the water is treated is very similar to what we are experiencing with our partnership with the Clackamas. So we think, chemistry wise, it will be a good match for what we currently have. And like I said, there's just no other options. Choices were made years ago that led us to where we are. I think they were good choices. Yeah, I think that covers it. Any questions for me?
Derek, please.
Just wondering if you would comment, if you have the background, what was the thrust behind the original restriction? Like, why is it in there?
Yeah, good question. So that was, I'm trying to remember how it was early 2000s, I believe, late 90s, early 2000s, when Wilsonville was working on developing their system. There was a lot of press related to the Willamette, and it was people literally, there were headlines about three-eyed frogs and fish dying in the river. And there was a lot of fear that, oh my gosh, I can't believe Wilsonville is actually going to drink this. And Tigard was talking about being a part of that. And, there was just a lot of fear and uproar about it. And I think that has proven, it's been proven that you can treat water to meet or exceed EPA standards.
So in your estimation, there's not really a reason to restrict the city's flexibility in this regard. Is that accurate?
That's correct. From a staff standpoint, that's absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. John, please.
Yeah, I think, Brian, it's even older than that, I think. Tigard and Tualatin, one group came in and ran a charter amendment for both cities at the same time. They both passed. It did relate to three-eyed fish and dead animals. A lot of it had to do with, there was some really nasty stuff in the Albany area coming out of some plants and stuff that were on the water. And so everything downstream of that, everybody was worried about. So if you were in the Corvallis area, it was fine, but everything from Albany through Newburgh, and everybody was really worried of all the runoff going in. Well, since then, the EPA standards have changed. They no longer can have that runoff in there. And then at the time, there wasn't anybody downstream using the water. Wilsonville was the first one that was considering it. Since they've done it, Sherwood's now done it. And now you have Hillsborough, Beaverton, and everywhere else that is now adding that. So it's been proven along the way that it's fine. It's just language at the time, years ago, more than 20 years ago, that this was put in where a group of people were very worried and nobody wanted to touch it. And the Willamette's a different river now. The standards are different, and the cleaning ability of the water is different. So, I said, 10 years ago, we should have taken this out. It made no sense. The reason I think it should be taken out also is it's confusing for our citizens, because there are actually citizens of Tigard that drink the Willamette River water, because there's the citizens of Tigard are served by Tigard Water District and the Tualatin Valley Water District. So the area of Metzger or Washington Square area, they actually already drink it and have access to it, and they're in the city. So we actually, Jason and me, we talked about this at length of, how do we even leave this in our charter when there's citizens that are doing that? And Shelby always said, well, legally, that's not our entity. But it's confusing because there's people in Tigard actually drinking the water. So, to me, it was so old and so long ago, and there was a big scare factor, and it was really easy propaganda for them to convince everybody when you show these pictures of the three-eyed fish that weren't even from the Willamette. So sorry for talking a long time, but.
Thank you, John. The context is always really helpful. And just to clarify, it was September 1999. That was the election that put this in the charter.
Yeah.
Margaret, please.
Yeah. And that's kind of surprising. In fact, I did ask Kim about this. I said, what is the background of this? And for those of you that either have not lived in Oregon a long time or the Portland area or are not old like me, the Willamette was a mess. It used to be the joke, we can walk on water as long as it's a Willamette River. It was horrible. And, but as I say, EPA has changed. A lot of the other, literally sewer was it was awful. But so many things have changed that it's almost like there's not a necessity for this. And I think to have the Willamette as a backup is something that's very important, because it's, I lived through the era that we were at the whim of Portland when it came to water. And if all of a sudden Portland said, oh, starting in July, we're not going to share our water anymore, they had the right to do that. So I think that it's something it's an option that we can have. And the original reason for not having the Willamette using the Willamette River is gone. So.
Thank you, Margaret. Jason, please.
Yeah, I mean, from a pragmatic perspective, I've got a couple different thoughts and have spent a fair bit of time thinking about this over the last 10 plus years. So I'll try to make that concise. The pragmatic part of me would say that actually, just educationally, the Willamette River is the only actual water rights the city, I believe, has in our own name. So that's an important piece of information for, I think, folks to know, and many don't. So us with this restriction in place basically says the only actual water rights that are in our name we're never going to perfect or use, which is kind of odd, I think. Similarly odd and confusing to the whole situation with people in the Tualatin Valley Water District in particular that are drinking Willamette water now. So that's the pragmatic part of me. It was also just from, as others have mentioned, from a very different time. A lot of the contamination and the bad sort of perspective, though, what John said about Albany is true, but the vast majority of the disgustingness was actually downriver and below the falls, and really through industrial North Portland, et cetera. And so I'm reminded of I rode TriMet for commuting for about 2 years straight. This one bus driver that was on my route every day, we'd drive over the Willamette, and as we were doing it every day, he'd say, the most beautiful Superfund site in the country. And then he'd just keep driving. And that was his way of talking about it. But that was North Portland, the industrial area. That was the most contaminated part. I just don't. So the last pragmatic part for me about this is that at some point, as a city with growth, we're going to need water from somewhere else, and we don't have another else to get it from. So at some point in the future, the choice may become, do we no longer have enough water to serve the city? Or are we going to get this language out of here to use water that we know is safe, and not have this sort of language that's really outdated and for an era that we're not even in? That's all.
Thank you, Jason. And Tony, please.
On the pragmatic side also, since it was mentioned that that's the only river that the city actually owns rights to, is there the potential in the future, or even the near term or long term, that the city could leverage those rights to generate revenue, or somehow use that to benefit the citizens, even if the city of Tigard doesn't need that water? And to me, I think that's a kind of a critical piece of that puzzle.
See John nodding his head. Do you want to take that?
Well, I just want to mention, Brian can talk a lot more about it, but we currently already leverage our rights, and not those perfected rights, but just the rights we've gotten through Lake Oswego, and that is our aspect of allowing Durham and King City and some part of unincorporated Washington County, which some people call Bull Mountain, to utilize that water. And there is some way to leverage that.
Thanks, John. Any other comments? So the proposal I have heard on the table goes back to our discussion question 1, which is the section still relevant and appropriate to the city charter in 2023? And I see Jason shaking his head, and I think I've heard, and John, and so most folks, thank you, Derek, saying that this is not appropriate and that you would like to see it removed in this committee's recommendation. Is that true? Let's remove it. Yep. Shelby, is that enough to go on?
Yep, I think so.
Great. And Margaret, please. Oh, you're muted.
This is just kind of a sidelight. My dad was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. We moved here because he was captain of the port here in Portland. And that would have been in like 59 to about 64 before he retired. And he used to talk about the Willamette because his boats were going through the Willamette on patrols and this kind of thing. And literally they would sometimes have to go through and wash it off because of all the crap, as he said, that was on their 40 footers. So things were really bad back then, but they have gotten a total turnaround. So.
Yes, thank you. Oh, the side of that boat just sounds so gross. So we have made it to the end of our agenda. You guys are being very deliberate with your questions and your comments and making decisions quickly. I know everyone's very excited, I think, to get to the elected officials section of our work plan. I'm just going to real quick show our schedule for this group. And Brian, thank you very much for being here this evening. Please go enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So path forward. So this is our February 13th meeting. Going into next meeting, we have a consultant coming in to talk specifically around urban renewal. That's why that one's bolded, because we have a specifically scheduled for that. And then we'll move into high capacity transit. Given the pace at which this group is moving, I anticipate that we will cover both of those topics just on the February 27th meeting. And we'll be able to move into elected officials, if not that night, and we'll plan that as if time allows, but definitely on March 13th. So you can anticipate all of these things kind of moving up one bucket. Any kind of questions about the schedule? All right, Jason, please.
Sorry, I couldn't get the electronic one up fast enough. I think that, I guess when I look at that schedule, one of the general questions I have is about our form of government. And it seems like the elected officials, city officers, like all that's kind of tied in together. So I'm wondering about, I understand wanting to segment it, and maybe that makes sense, but I think in some ways we may have to be a little flexible about, or perhaps have a discussion before we get into the elected officials, city officers, and then election process about our actual form of government, because I think the rest of that sort of follows from that.
Yeah.
From my perspective.
You are completely correct. We are going to start. So the way we're kind of thinking about it, and we have 30 minutes left in our time together. Let's have this discussion. Is that form of government can be boiled down to what power does the mayor hold versus the city council versus city officials. So when we talk, so we're going to start that conversation at the form of government and really the mayor's office, and then move on from there into the other areas, including the number of counselors, how those counselors are selected, and then city officials. There's a big difference between having a city manager versus having a city administrative officer versus not having one, but that all really still comes back to what power does the mayor hold? How do you feel about that kind of frame?
I just want to make sure it's framed in a way that because that discussion, lots of things follow from that. So it sounds like you all have planned for that.
Yes, yeah, we're really looking forward to that conversation. I've been putting together resources and homework for the group as we come up on those. Speaking of resources and homework, because I still have you for 30 minutes, we've been sending out these meeting guides with discussion questions and reference documents. Are folks finding those helpful and useful? Is there something in addition that you would like for us to be providing, something that's missing? All feedback is welcome. John, please.
Well, I don't have an answer to that question. I want to go back to before. Is earlier tonight, and we were talking fees, and specifically Shelby was talking about fees related to, public improvements. But there are cities around Gresham, Coos Bay, where they actually do have a fee for, police services, or example like Sherwood, where they put limitations on fees, where they do require a public vote of raising a fee more than a certain percentage. I think those are worth having a short conversation on. I just think we should educate this whole committee here on what those are versus just skipping over those.
Yep, Shelby's nodding. We will add that to future agenda topic. Thank you, John. Shelby.
Yeah. So actually, I don't know if the group has enough time to formulate thoughts on that, but it does seem to fit in line with tonight's discussion. So
Right.
I think if anybody has comments on that, I'd be interested to hear them now.
Derek, please.
Just echoing John's concern, it's almost like we're on the same wavelength. When he brought up earlier that other municipalities were counting a police services as a potential utility, that was a point of concern at that time. And we kind of moved on, so we didn't address it. And I figured maybe we'd have ample opportunity, but seeing as we're here and we're talking about it now, I would like to see some form of discussion, whether tonight or before this charter committee, finishes its work, to incorporate appropriate safeguards against misuse, because I consider that to be a misuse of that type of power, just personally. And I'd love to know what other people think about it as well.
Yeah, and Shelby, maybe this is a question for you. One of the things that came to mind when that was brought up is it sounded like most of the special assessments had to be against real property, which when you're talking about utilities, usually there is property. Maybe I'm not thinking about this correctly, but the police as a utility doesn't, I guess there's a police station. There's not as much real property as attached.
Right. So I think there's the difference between saying that police is a utility and having a fee for police on the utility bill. So the case law that established the city's ability to implement a fee on the utility bill for police, well, it actually was a fee for police. And so it wasn't that it was necessarily that the calling police a utility, it was that by assessing a fee, which is basically to be a fee, it has to be directly related to what it is funding. So a police fee or a parks and recreation fee has to be limited specifically to that funding. So you can't have like a general fee, that's called a tax. So it has to be specifically related to what it's funding. The other thing is that it has to be equal in terms of it cannot be based on property value. And so once we start getting into the value of property, that's what's called an ad valorem tax in Oregon. It's based on the property value, and those have to be approved by the voters as well. So going back to the example earlier about the Parks and Rec fee in Tigard, that is based on, dwelling units? Equivalent dwelling units in Tigard. So that is, and then there's a different calculation for businesses. So that is a fee that it has nothing to do with how much your property is worth. It has nothing to do with the size of your property or anything. It is related to your property. A home is considered equal to all other homes, basically. So that's those are the parameters for fees and taxes. If it's going to be a broadly applicable tax, or if it's going to be based on property value, whereas people who have higher value homes pay more, that's an ad valorem property tax that needs to be voted on. So the city has broad authority to implement fees. They can be challenged in terms of they can be appealed to city council, and they can be appealed to a circuit court that the city has extended beyond its authority to adopt fees. But if it's a tax, that specifically has to be approved by the voters. So your public safety levy is an example of that was specifically voter authorized for a certain number of years for a certain number of, or for a certain set topic.
But Shelby, can't we add that fee whenever we want? And I think that's sort of what I think Derek's thinking about is, I know that Coos Bay, they wanted to put it $20 for public safety, and the citizens came out and says, we want to vote on it, and they made it 15. So it's the kind of thing that I think I'm a big proponent of. You elect your counselors and they make the decision. But I think there's times where, and Jason will realize that when the park and rec fee came before the city, I think they gave us 3 different options. It was like $8 and $14 and $20. I didn't vote for any of them. I didn't want it. I felt that if the citizens wanted it, they would come forward and figure out a way to pay for it. I have a hard time just adding fees. And the reason I always say that, and the park and rec fee has gone up from that original $7.98 or whatever. So, they always go up, but I just have a hard time raising a fee, because you get to a point where all of a sudden, like in Sherwood, you say, okay, we're limiting all fees to 3%. They can't go up any more than that. Well, the good side of that is you limit your fees. The bad side of that is their city then decided every fee was going to go up 3%, even if it wasn't one they're going to raise before. So it got very difficult from the standpoint of, you get unintended consequences again for things that, you don't think about. So I'm not saying that the charter, that I would like to put a limit on ours, but at the same time, I don't think the public understands how much ability the council has to add those fees whenever they want. And everybody calls it a water bill, but it's not. Like Shelby says correctly, it's a utility bill, but all I hear around the town is, God, my water bill keeps going up. And I'm like, your water bill is this much. You have stormwater sewer, you have, stormwater sewer, you have, the park and rec, everything else. Your water bill is really small and it doesn't go up very much.
Thank you, John. I used to work with Hillsborough quite a bit as a consultant. They have the same problem. Everyone calls it their water bill. Karen, please.
I appreciate what Derek was saying, because I feel like back to, I forget now what we were talking about, but it was Jason and John were saying, oh, I would never do that. Oh, probably the second reading. I would never do that. Heidi probably wouldn't do it either. But if we're looking at this as a future forward-looking document, somebody's probably not going to campaign on the fact that they want to make the police a utility. They're probably not going to be saying that up front, so that we would know to not vote for them. This is just like, you want something, you want them to have the flexibility to do what they need to do. And just in case somebody is going to take advantage, we want to put some kind of safeguard that they can't take advantage, or that without having to go back and like reactively try to undo something or recall somebody or things like that. It's a hard one. It's a very hard one.
Yeah, I guess something to consider too is when you start defining utility, there's a lot of utilities that didn't exist 20 years ago that we consider utilities now, including internet, and I guess phone service has been around longer than 20 years, but cell phone service, not so much. Tony, please.
Yeah, I think kind of what I think is being discussed is kind of what kind of checks and balances we can come up with in this language, but also maybe mitigate that unintended consequence that a lot of times happens when you put a hard limit on something, where they just come through and say, oh, well, everything's going to be 3%, or we're going to spend the maximum that you allow us to spend, or the maximum fee. Something that requires a vote, to me as a citizen, I much appreciate that, because then you feel like you have a voice in it. And if like say if the city council decided that, downtown needs to be the best downtown in the world, and we're going to spend, $2 million on art, and we're going to raise a fee for that, and there's going to be an art fee every year from now on, that could be, there could be a consensus with that on the council. I'm not saying, that's just like an example that maybe there would be some contention with the rest of the city, because they might not see the advantage for their area. So they might not feel like their money's being spent wisely for their fees. That kind of area where somebody would be able to vote, and I'm waving my hands around and nobody can see me. So just so you know, I'm waving my hands around to explain what I'm doing. Sorry. But yeah, that's some sort of vote or public input where there's a check and balance on any city council. Because while I understand the idea that you'd like to say, well, those people are voted for, they should be able to have the power to do what they need to do. it's still a small number of people, and a charismatic person or a majority, if it's not a unanimous vote requirement, then a simple majority or whatever could get that passed through. Could be a lot of fees that a lot of people would get upset with and might not have any power to change.
Thank you, Tony. Any other comments on this area? It's an interesting question. Well, this kind of got sprung on, I think, the group. I mean, interesting question that came out of our discussion. So feel free to continue to consider it. We'll see about other examples that may exist in other charters and introduce those to the group as well, if there's anything that we see that's promising. Jason, please.
Just an observation. I noticed that, to me, it's really important that we always have everybody participating. And I think Holly's been raising her hand a little bit, but I don't think Holly or Zena I've heard speak tonight. And I guess I just want to make sure that they feel like they can, and that if others are dominating the conversation, that we manage that. I don't know. I just wanted to check in about that because as a facilitator in my brain, I noticed that, and I just wanted to check in on it. Sorry.
Thanks, Jason. No, it's a great observation. Holly, please.
I'm having some computer issues tonight, but every time I've had a question, someone else has answered it. So you guys have been great. Like every time I have a question, I'm over here nodding. If my camera was able to work, you'd see that. So every question I've had has been answered by the wonderful questions of everybody else.
Thank you, Holly. Zena, please.
Yeah, today there was like a lot of things to learn, and there were a lot of questions. So I was more listening and didn't want to interrupt in between for unnecessarily confusing. So mostly I was listening today and learning about it, about the different topics.
And these topics are new to a lot of people in this room, myself included. So if there is something that is confusing, I encourage you, please bring it to this group. There's probably someone else that is confusing it, finds it confusing as well.
Okay.
I also understand sometimes being in this larger group can make anybody uncomfortable. We will be starting to use breakout rooms after we move through high capacity transit. So we'll be having a lot of those elected official, city manager, form of government conversations in a smaller format where folks can speak a little more organically, and it's not quite the same format. So something to look forward to.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Jason, for noticing it. And it was like, I didn't want to make more confusion there. Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Zena. Okay, Karen, please.
Back to the question you asked. I have appreciated the materials very much, especially the links that probably would have taken me hours to find on my own. I'm positive if I could even find them. So I have 2 thumbs up for the materials that you've been providing us.
Great. If there is anything in the future that we can do, or if anyone has any other comments to make things easier, to make sure that everybody's prepared, you're all doing such a great job with doing your, we call it homework. And we really appreciate it. I think it helps these conversations go much more smoothly when everybody kind of comes in prepared. So anything that we can do to help with that, please let us know. And with that, I think we're going to end it here. So thank you all very much. Happy early Valentine's Day tomorrow night, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.